Everybody here should see what you actually are. I'm not fighting you. Say it louder. Let your daughter hear it.
Go home, Tristan.
Or what? You'll ask nicely again?
Let the boy settle it, Terrence.
Pick him up, coward!
The gloves landed in front of a man the neighborhood had never once heard raise his voice. To everyone standing on that green Terrence Maddox was a quiet single father who worked from home and went out of his way to avoid trouble. Tristan Bellamy read that quiet as fear, and his own father had spent the whole summer encouraging the reading. But Terrence never looked at the young fighter's face. He watched the hands, the weight settling into the back heel, the way a man looks when he is counting seconds instead of measuring courage. How badly had Tristan misjudged the man standing in front of him? If stories like this one are the kind you find yourself thinking about hours later, consider subscribing before we go on. It costs you nothing, and it keeps these stories coming. 4 months before those gloves ever hit the grass, nobody on Ashcroft Lane could have told a stranger much of anything about Terrence Maddox. They knew he was 45, that he kept his lawn short and his garage door closed, and that he did something with security systems out of a home office. They knew he had a daughter. Beyond that, the neighborhood had filed him under quiet and moved on, which was exactly the arrangement he had spent 3 years building. The truth lived in one drawer. Inside the desk in his office, underneath a folder of client contracts, there was a letter in Rachel's handwriting from the last month she had been strong enough to write. She had been sick a long time before the end, and she had used those weeks to say things properly instead of quickly. Terrence had read that letter so many times he could recite it, and he still took it out and read it anyway, because reciting was not the same as hearing her. One line in it had shaped the last 3 years of his life more than any sentence anyone had ever spoken to him. Do not let the war become the thing that defines you in her eyes. He had read that as an instruction, and he had carried it out the way he had carried out every instruction he was ever given, which meant completely. There were no medals in the house, no photographs in uniform, no unit plaques, no folded flag, and no stories at dinner. There was also no mention ever to anyone on that street of the 16 years he had spent in the United States Navy, or of the men he had led, or of the fact that for a portion of those years he had commanded a SEAL element doing work nobody wrote about afterward. Sierra knew a thin version. She knew her father had served, that he had been overseas, and that he did not like being asked. At 16, she had stopped asking, not because she had lost interest, but because she had learned what the silence cost him. That spring something had come along that mattered more than pride, and it was called Ridgeline Health. Terrence had been working toward a consulting contract to rebuild physical security across the system's 4 regional hospitals, 3 years renewable. It was not glamorous work. It was door access protocols and staff screening and lockdown procedure, and it would have covered every dollar of Sierra's tuition without her ever filling out a loan application in her life. The file sat on the corner of his desk in a plain folder, because the last stage of the process was the part that required care. Ridgeline ran a full background verification on any consultant with unescorted facility access, and their standard was blunt about one condition: no unresolved legal or civil disputes involving the consultant. Nothing filed, nothing pending. Terrence had read that clause twice when it arrived, and thought nothing of it, because he had spent 3 years being a man about whom there was nothing to report. The Bellamys moved in during the first week of April. Preston Bellamy bought the large property to the east, a house that had sat unsold for 11 months because of the price, and he paid for it in a way that gave people reasons to mention it to each other. He developed commercial real estate. He sat on committees. He had the manner of a man who had never needed to raise his voice because rooms generally rearranged themselves around him before he got the chance. His son came with him. Tristan Bellamy was 22, a black belt in karate, who had also trained Brazilian jiu-jitsu for 6 years and won all 3 of his amateur mixed martial arts bouts. The skill was not invented, and that was the part people underestimated. He could move, he could read a body, and he had put in more mat hours by 22 than most men put into anything. What he had learned alongside the skill was the problem. Preston had raised him on one principle repeated so often, it had stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like a law of nature. A Bellamy is never permitted to look weak. Under that rule, disagreements were not disagreements. They were contests, and contests had a winner and a loser, and the boy had never once been offered a third possibility. The gym where he trained sat 20 minutes south, a low brick building with a hand-painted sign run by a man named Warren Keats, who was 63 and had been teaching in that same room since before Tristan was born. Keats had written him up twice already that year, for excessive force on training partners, once for a takedown that put a 19-year-old's shoulder in a sling for a month. Tristan signed both write-ups without arguing, and Keats found that more troubling than arguing would have been. The second time, Keats kept him after class, sat on the edge of the mat, and finally said the thing he had been circling for months. "You're training to beat people," Keats told him. "In this room we train so we don't have to." Tristan pulled his water bottle off the bench and smiled at him on the way out. "That sounds like something you tell the guys who lose." There was another moment that spring that meant nothing to anyone at the time. On a Tuesday morning in late April, Terrence walked out to the mailbox in a t-shirt and yesterday's jeans, and an older man came down the sidewalk with a gray-muzzled retriever on a leash. White hair cut close, 70 maybe more, and a back so straight it looked less like posture and more like something installed decades ago and never removed. They passed within 4 feet of each other. The older man slowed without quite stopping and looked at Terrence a half-second longer than a stranger looks at a stranger the way people do when a face is familiar and they cannot place where from. Then he gave a short nod, the kind that is not a greeting, so much as an acknowledgement, and kept walking. Terrence took his mail, went inside, and closed the door harder than the door required. He did not go back out that morning. A week later, Denise Alcott from across the street mentioned in passing that the family at the end of the block had a relative staying with them through the summer. Some uncle who had just retired and did not seem to know what to do with himself. Terrence said that was nice and went back to trimming his hedge, and the sentence dissolved into the ordinary noise of a neighborhood in spring. The trouble started properly on a Saturday afternoon in May. Sierra was washing the sedan in the driveway with the doors open and music coming out of it loud enough to reach the street, which was a thing she had done most Saturdays for 2 years without a complaint from anyone. Tristan came across the property line in workout clothes and told her the noise was interfering with his session. She kept the sponge moving and told him he was welcome to shut his own windows. What happened next took about 4 seconds. He reached through the open door and twisted the volume down himself, and when she came around the hood, telling him to get out of her car, he picked her phone up off the seat and threw it underhand into the street. It skidded 12 feet and stopped face down near the storm drain. He never looked at where it landed. He looked at her, waiting to see what she was going to do about it. Terrence had been at the front window with a mug in his hand for the last 30 seconds of that. He came out and down the driveway without hurrying, and he did not go toward Tristan at all. He walked past both of them into the street, crouched, picked up the phone, checked the screen, and put it in his daughter's hands. Then he turned around and looked at the young man for the first time. "Apologize to her," he said. "Then get off my property." Tristan closed the distance until there were 8 inches between them and used the 4 inches of height he had, which is a thing that works on almost everybody. It did not work. Terrence did not step back and did not lean away, and the complete absence of a reaction seemed to confuse him more than a shove would have. He left eventually, laughing, telling a friend on the phone as he crossed the grass that the neighbor was a coward. That night at dinner, Sierra did not say anything at all, and her father noticed, because in 3 years of the two of them eating alone at that table, she had never once been the quiet one. He asked her twice if she was all right. She said she was fine both times, and neither of them believed it, and the plates went into the sink. That was the first thing his silence cost him, and what it cost was how he looked in his daughter's eyes. Through the rest of May, the incidents came in small doses. Music off, trash cans moved, cars parked 6 inches over lines. Then, in the first week of June, Tristan and 3 friends were kicking a soccer ball on the strip of grass between the properties, and the ball went into the lilacs along the fence, and instead of stepping around them, one of them went through. By the time Terrence got outside, 3 of the 8 bushes were snapped off near the base. Rachel had planted those in the second spring they owned the house. Terrence came across the lawn and asked them to stop in the same voice he used for everything, which was probably what did it. Tristan came over the low rail fence into the Maddox yard, took a fistful of Terrence's shirt at the collar, and shoved him backward the way a man shoves someone he has already decided cannot do anything about it. Terrence's body answered before his judgment got a vote. There was no punch. There was no kick, no strike, nothing that would leave a bruise anyone could photograph. There was a hand finding the outside of a wrist, a quarter turn of the hips, a shift of weight into a direction. The young man's structure did not support. And then a black belt was on both knees in the grass in front of 3 people he trained with. It took less than 1 second, and what came afterward was the part that mattered. Terrence let it go immediately. He did not hold the position, did not stand over him, did not look at the friends. He put his hand down and offered to help him up. Tristan slapped it away and got to his feet on his own, and his face had gone a color none of the others had seen on him before, because he had not been beaten. He had been switched off by a man he had decided months ago did not count for anything. Preston came out the side door in time to see his son brushing grass off his knees, and he took his son's side inside of 10 seconds. He talked about attorneys, about the homeowners association, about how a man living alone with a teenage girl and working in security was something the board might want to be aware of. Terrence said nothing and went inside, and the door closed, and that was the end of the daylight portion of it. The rest happened after dark in the Bellamy's front room, and it did more damage than anything that had occurred on the lawn. Preston stood at the window with a glass in his hand and looked at the fence line, while his son sat on the arm of the couch with a bag of ice on his wrist he did not actually need. What Preston saw in his son's face was not injury. It was humiliation, and he had spent 22 years teaching the boy that humiliation was the only real wound there was. "You understand what happens if it ends here," Preston said, not turning around. "Every person on this street remembers that he put you on your knees. That's the whole story. That's the only part anybody keeps." Tristan said he understood. He went out to the converted garage at 11 o'clock and sat on the weight bench with the video one of his friends had shot, and he scrubbed it back and forth with 2 fingers at quarter speed over and over. He was not watching himself go down. He was watching the 11 frames before that, where the hand closed on his wrist and the angle set. 15 years of training let him see what his friends could not. From that grip with the elbow stacked, the way it was, another 8 or 10 degrees of rotation, and the joint would have gone. Not sprained. Gone. And the rotation had stopped deliberately in exactly the place a person only finds if he knows precisely where the edge is and has decided in advance not to cross it. He sat in the dark garage with the light of the phone on his face and could not make the thing fit anywhere. In the world his father had spent his whole life describing, there was no reason a man holding an advantage would decline to use it. There was no version of strong that looked like that. So he did the only thing available to him, which was close the video and decide it had been a cheap grab, a lucky one, a thing that would not happen twice. The question stayed anyway. It sat unanswered in the back of his head all summer, and it would be the last thing he ever said to Terrence Maddox. Preston did not come back over the fence after that night. What arrived instead came through the mail slot and the association portal, one item at a time, in the polite institutional language of a man who had never in his life needed to threaten anyone directly. A complaint about music in the driveway on weekends. A complaint that the rail fence exceeded the permitted height by 4 inches, which it had for 9 years. A complaint about the sedan touching the apron, and one about weeds behind the garage. Then, in the middle of July, Preston filed a civil nuisance action in County Small Claims Court, naming Terrence Maddox and alleging a pattern of threatening conduct toward neighbors. He asked for $400 in damages, which was the point. The money was never the point. What he wanted was a case number, a public docket, and a matter that would sit there unresolved for as long as his attorney could keep it there. He brought the filing to the association meeting on the third Thursday of that month in the clubhouse with the folding chairs and the coffee urn and the ceiling fan that clicked. He did not raise his voice once in 12 minutes. He brought a folder, photographs with dates printed in the corners, and a typed timeline, and he asked the board for nothing, except that they note a concern in the record, so that if anything further occurred, there would at least be a history. That was the sentence that made it work, and everyone in the room understood it somewhere below language. Nobody had to accuse anybody of anything. Nobody had to be the person who said it out loud. They only had to agree that a note in a file is a small thing, and a small thing is very easy to agree to. Terrence sat in the last row with his hands on his knees and listened to people he had waved at for 9 years decide that a note was reasonable. Some of them studied the floor while it happened. A few nodded because Preston's firm leased retail space from one of them and had put a roofing job through another that spring, and because their sons trained at the same gym, and because agreeing was simply easier than not agreeing. Denise Alcott sat in the third row with her purse in her lap and said nothing, which was what most people did, and nobody noticed her one way or the other. Terrence went home and did not mention any of it to his daughter. That was the second thing his silence cost him, and this time the price was a case number with his name on it in a public county database. Through the rest of July, Tristan handled his end publicly. He posted about the neighbor who had jumped him in his own yard, and he told the story at the gym to anyone who would listen with one specific edit in it, that the whole thing had been a cheap shot from behind he never saw coming. He said it often enough that he seemed to have started believing it, which is what happens to people who need a version of an event more than they need the event. What he wanted and said openly was a fair one in front of everybody with somebody recording. The call from Ridgeline came on a Tuesday afternoon in the last week of July from a woman in vendor compliance whose voice was apologetic in the way of a person delivering procedure rather than opinion. Their screening had returned an open civil action naming the consultant, and under Section 4 of the standard terms, she could not move the file forward until it was resolved. She was careful to say the contract was not canceled. It was on hold pending clarification, and she was sure it would sort itself out. Terrence thanked her and set the phone down beside the plain folder on the corner of the desk. He knew exactly what had happened, and he also knew no attorney alive would ever prove that a $400 nuisance suit had been filed for the purpose of appearing in a hospital systems vendor screening. Preston had never touched him. Preston had never needed to touch anyone. The lilacs were already gone, and now 3 years of tuition was sitting on somebody's desk waiting for clarification, and Terrence still said nothing to anyone about any of it. That was the third price, and it was the first one that came with a dollar figure. His daughter, meanwhile, had been watching the entire summer with the specific attention of a 16-year-old who has worked out that the adults are not going to fix this. Sierra had seen the pattern before her father was willing to name it. Every time he absorbed something quietly, the next thing was larger. So she stopped waiting for him, and in the second week of August, she started a folder on her phone labeled with nothing but the year, and she began filling it. She screenshotted the posts before they could be deleted, and the comments underneath, and the messages Tristan's friends were sending to people at her school. In the third week of August, she was at Lindenhurst Park when he backed a 14-year-old boy against a fence over a bicycle left across a walking path, and she stood behind a tree and recorded 51 seconds of a grown man explaining to a child what was going to happen to him. She saved all of it and told her father none of it because she had concluded that telling him was the same as throwing it away. That was the fourth price, and it was the highest one yet. His daughter had started defending the family alone because she no longer believed he would. Labor Day fell on the first Monday of September, and the neighborhood held the cookout. It held every year on the common green at the end of the lane. Long tables under the oaks, 2 grills going, children in a sprinkler, the light gone gold and long across the grass by late afternoon, with most of 100 people still there. Denise Alcott had her handheld camcorder out the way she did at every block event, and the only person who happened to register that she was filming was Terrence, who noticed things like that without meaning to. Tristan came across the green with 4 friends from the gym behind him, and they spread into a loose arc without being told, to the way people do when they have watched enough footage of this kind of thing. 3 phones were already recording before he reached the tables. Preston stood 30 feet off near the drink table, with a cup in his hand, and did not move toward his son or away from him. Sierra was a step behind her father's left shoulder with a plate she never got to set down. What almost nobody at those tables understood was that the young man walking toward Terrence Maddox was not there to win an argument. He had spent 3 months unable to explain 11 frames of video to himself, and the only way he knew to make the question go away was to run the whole thing again in public, where the result would be recorded and permanent, and could not be scrubbed back and forth in a dark garage at quarter speed. Terrence did not pick up the gloves that landed in the grass at his feet. What followed was roughly 2 minutes of a 22-year-old working through everything he could think of in front of an audience. He started with the usual material about cowardice. Then he brought up Rachel and what a woman must have been thinking in a hospital bed knowing what she was married to. Then he turned to Sierra and told her loud enough for the nearest 3 tables that her father was too gutless to defend his own name. Terrence turned to walk away with his hand on his daughter's back to steer her. And that was when Tristan stepped across and took hold of her arm to block the path. She wrenched free hard, which she was entitled to do, and the wrench put her off her center at the edge of the concrete apron where the tables met the grass. She went down onto both palms. The skin tore off the heels of both hands, and there was blood on the pavement inside of 4 seconds. Terrence stopped walking and turned around, and everybody close enough to see his face described the same thing afterward in different words, which was that something in the man simply went out the way a room goes when a switch is thrown. He looked at his daughter on the ground, and then he gave the young man one more chance using the same words he had used in his own driveway in May, and not one word more. "Apologize to her," he said. "Then get off my property." He glanced once at the grass under his feet and corrected himself. "Then leave. That's the end of it." Tristan pulled the gloves on, and the first exchange lasted about 6 seconds and settled the question of whether he could actually fight because he could. He came in fast and clean, a proper combination. Hands high weight. Correct every single thing Warren Keats had spent years drilling into him. Terrence did not throw a punch then or at any point after. He slipped outside the line, changed the angle by about a foot, and let the momentum carry the boy 2 steps past where he expected to be, and the crowd made a noise because he had missed something that should not have been missable. The second time, Tristan committed harder, and Terrence stepped into him instead of away, which is the one thing nobody is trained to expect. He took the elbow, redirected the hips, and put him in the grass, using nothing except the speed the young man had brought with him. He did not follow him down. He stepped back with his hands open at his sides. "Stay down," he said. The spinning kick came third, and it was genuinely good, and it never finished. Terrence read the shoulder turn and moved forward into the dead space before the leg had built any power, so the kick came around and landed shin first against a body already inside its arc, and Tristan lost his base and went down again. Terrence backed off 2 steps and said it a second time in the same flat voice, telling him to stay down. Then the boy shot for the double leg, which was his best discipline and his best chance, and Terrence rolled his weight over the top of it, reversed the direction, and pinned him for 2 seconds before letting go and stepping clear. "Stay down," he said for the 3rd time, "somewhere in there." The crowd stopped sounding like a crowd, because people were beginning to understand what they were watching. This was not a fighter beating another fighter. There were no strikes, no faces of aggression, no attempt to score or finish or prove. The man was moving the way somebody moves, who has been trained to end a dangerous situation in the shortest possible time, and who was very visibly in front of 100 witnesses, choosing not to. Preston Bellamy called across the green, then in the voice he used for closing rooms. "Get up. Do not let this man humiliate you." Whatever was left of his son's control went out with that sentence. He came up off the grass, and instead of coming forward, He went sideways to the nearest grill, took a metal skewer off the rack, 3 feet of steel with a wooden handle, and swung it in a flat horizontal arc without aiming it at anything, which is the most dangerous kind of swing there is. Terrence told him to put it down and stay down, which was the 4th time and the last. Sierra had been running toward her father from the tables since the moment the skewer left the rack, and she ran directly into the path of it. What her father did occupied less than 1 full second, and afterward nobody could break it into parts. He put his left hand on her shoulder and drove her clear of the arc, caught the swinging forearm with his right, stripped the skewer out of the hand like taking a spoon from a toddler, dropped the young man face down on the concrete apron, and folded both wrists into the small of his back. There was no wasted motion anywhere in it. There was nothing that looked like anger in it either, which was somehow the part that frightened people. The green went completely quiet. Terrence knelt with his knee against a shoulder blade, told the nearest man to call an ambulance for his daughter's hands, and told the second nearest to call the sheriff's office. And he said both things in a level carrying voice that nobody on that street had ever heard him use. An older man came out from under the oaks and walked toward them without hurrying. White hair cut close to back that stood too straight for a man in his 70s, and Terrence had seen him exactly once before on a Tuesday morning in April with a gray-muzzled retriever on a leash. In April, the face had only been familiar. What placed it now was not the face at all. It was the shape of the restraint, the exact placement of the knee, and a command voice that belonged to one particular branch of one particular service. Admiral Conrad Sutter, 31 years in the United States Navy, retired that spring and, staying with his brother's family at the end of the block, stopped 8 feet away and looked down at the pin. Commander Maddox, Preston Bellamy stopped talking in the middle of a sentence about attorneys. 100 people standing on a lawn did the arithmetic at the same moment. And Tristan, with his cheek against warm concrete and both wrists locked in a grip that had never once tightened beyond what was necessary to hold him, finally understood the thing he had been scrubbing back and forth at quarter speed since June. There had been no trick and no luck. The man had been holding back on purpose from the very first second and had just done it again 4 separate times in front of everyone. 2 deputies arrived within 9 minutes, took the skewer, took statements from 11 people, and left with nobody in handcuffs, while the paramedics were still working on Sierra's hands. Preston understood something too, which was that his son had lost on the only ground where losing could be seen. So he went back to his own ground before the ambulance reached the end of the street. He called the sheriff's non-emergency line himself that night to file his own account first, and he had an attorney working before midnight, and at 11 the next morning a video went out. It ran 40 seconds. There was no footage in it of a hand closing on a girl's arm, none of a skewer coming off a grill rack, and none of a man saying, "Stay down," 4 separate times. It began with a 22-year-old on the ground and a 45-year-old kneeling on his back, and it ended there, and it went where things like that always go. By that evening it was carrying a headline that traveled faster than any correction ever would. Former Navy SEAL attacks local black belt fighter at family cookout. The story inverted completely inside of 2 days. Sierra walked into school on Wednesday with gauze on both palms and was filmed in the hallway twice before lunch. The woman from Ridgeline Compliance called on Thursday, and this time it was not a hold, it was a withdrawal, and she did not sound apologetic because there was no longer any procedure to be apologetic about. An anonymous report reached the County Child Protective Office on Friday morning, and an interview was scheduled for the last Wednesday in September. And by the weekend, Preston's attorney had told a reporter carefully, as speculation, that the community's real concern here was untreated post-traumatic stress in a man raising a teenage girl alone. Sierra came into the kitchen the following Monday night while her father was standing at the sink running water over a pan he had already cleaned. The gauze was off by then, and the skin underneath had gone the raw pink color that scabs over in patches, and she stood on the other side of the counter until he shut the water off. What she said was not what he had spent 10 days bracing for. She told him she did not care that he had been a Navy SEAL and never had. What she could not get past was that a man she had lived with for 16 years had decided on his own that she was not to be trusted with the truth about who he was. She had found out the same way the rest of the neighborhood found out, standing on a lawn with blood on her hands, from a stranger with white hair who happened to recognize a restraint hold. For 3 years, she had assumed her father was quiet because he was grieving, and she had built her entire idea of him around being careful with him, and it turned out she had been being careful with a stranger. Terrence went into the office and came back with the letter and set it on the counter between them and told her it was the last thing her mother ever wrote and that he had never shown it to a living soul. Then he watched his daughter read her mother's handwriting for the first time in 3 years, and somewhere in the middle of that, standing in his own kitchen with a dish towel in his hand, he finally understood that he had been obeying an instruction that had never been given. Rachel had not written that he should erase himself. She had written that the war should not be the thing that defined him in Sierra's eyes. She had been asking him to be more than one thing, and he had read it as an order to be nothing, and he had carried that out with the same total obedience he had once brought to far worse orders. For 3 years he had called it discipline. It had simply been easier to call it discipline than to call it what it was. He told her the rest while she was still holding the paper. He said the silence had never been entirely about protecting her, and that a good part of it had always been about the fact that he had never once sat down and dealt with losing her mother. Talking about the Navy meant talking about the years Rachel spent waiting for him to come home, and talking about that meant talking about Rachel, so he had shut the whole thing in a drawer and given the shutting a respectable name. Sierra listened to all of it, and did not let him off, and she also did not leave the kitchen, which was the only thing he needed her to do. Conrad Sutter came to the house on Tuesday morning, sat in the front room with his hat in his hands, and laid out 2 entirely different offers, as though they were on a table between them. The first was that he still knew people that 31 years buys a man a certain phone list, and that if he made 4 calls, this thing would be on a national desk by Friday, and Preston Bellamy would be finished inside a week. He said it plainly, without any pleasure in it, the way a man states a capability. The second offer was much smaller. He could sit in a chair and say exactly what he had seen with his own 2 eyes on that green, no more than that, and let it be worth whatever it turned out to be worth. He had watched the whole thing from under the oaks. He had heard the man tell the boy to stay down 4 separate times, and he had a fairly precise idea of what somebody with that training could have done to a 22-year-old and had chosen not to do. Terrence turned down the first offer, and the reason he gave was the only one that mattered to him. "If I win it that way," and he said, "then all this ever was is a man with better connections beating a man with more money. And my daughter learns exactly the lesson Preston Bellamy has been teaching his son since the boy could walk. I'd rather lose the contract than teach her that." What he chose instead was the slow version evidence and witnesses and the truth and nothing else on the scale, which left the problem of Denise Alcott. Terrence walked across the street on Wednesday evening and stood on her porch and asked her for the original recording, and she told him no through the storm door. Her husband had been the subcontractor on 2 Bellamy projects that year and was bidding on a third, and she said the word bidding the way people say it when they mean a mortgage and a daughter in her 2nd year of college. He could have reminded her that she had been sitting in the 3rd row in July with her purse in her lap while a room full of neighbors put a notation in his file. He did not bring it up, and afterward he was never entirely sure whether that had been decency or exhaustion. He told her he understood that she did not owe him anything at all, and that the county file would stay open until the following Wednesday if she changed her mind. Then he thanked her for her time and went home. She knocked on his door on Friday night at 9:15 with the memory card in a plastic sleeve, and she gave the reason before he could ask for it. She had watched her own footage more than a dozen times that week, and the thing keeping her awake was not anything Terrence Maddox had done. It was the 9 minutes and 40 seconds in which he kept declining to do what was plainly visibly available to him. A man provoked in front of 100 people refusing over and over to end it was the single most uncomfortable thing she had ever recorded, because it made every person standing on that lawn watching, including her, look like exactly what they were. The interview happened in a county office with a laminate table and a window that did not open. The caseworker was a woman in her 50s who had clearly done this several thousand times and had stopped being impressed by anybody, and she asked her questions in order. She asked about anger management. She asked about the 16 years, what specifically he had done during them, and how often he thought about it. She asked without any cruelty in it at all whether a 16-year-old girl living alone with a man who had that training was in a safe home. Terrence answered every question in a level voice and did not defend himself once. He confirmed the service. He confirmed what he had done on the green. When she asked whether he had lost control at any point that afternoon, he told her that if he had lost control, the young man would not have walked away, and that this was not a boast, but the entire reason he had spent 30 years learning not to. Then Sierra asked whether she could say something, and the caseworker set down her pen. Sierra put her phone on the laminate, opened the folder she had been building alone since August, and went through it in order the way her father would have. The posts, the comments, the messages to people at her school, the 51 seconds from behind a tree at Lindenhurst Park. She said she had built all of it by herself over 3 weeks without telling her father, because at the time she had not believed he would do anything with it. She said she had been angry at him for that, and still was. And then she told the woman across the table the thing that ended the interview. "I've lived with him for 16 years, she said. In 16 years, I have never once had to wonder whether he was about to hurt somebody. Not even on the one afternoon when every single person watching would have understood it if he did." Denise Alcott's original went to the county and the sheriff's office that same week, all 9 minutes and 40 seconds of it, with nothing cut. Conrad Sutter gave his statement and confined it exactly to what he had seen. Warren Keats, who had been sitting on 2 signed write-ups since spring, drove them over himself after watching the unedited video twice in his office with the door shut. The story turned over completely inside of 9 days. Tristan Bellamy was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, and the plea he took in November gave him 24 months of probation, 120 hours of community service, and mandatory completion of an anger management program before probation could close. His amateur sponsor withdrew the same week the charging documents became public in a 2-sentence statement that did not use his name. Keats stripped the belt in the front room of the gym with the class standing along the wall, and what he said while he did it was the same shape as what he had said in that room in the spring. "The belt proves what you can do," he told him. "What you do with it is the only thing that ever proves who you are." Preston Bellamy came apart more slowly and far more thoroughly. The 40-second edit and the 2 phone calls he made to witnesses in the days after Labor Day became a matter for the district attorney, and the words evidence tampering and witness intimidation appeared in a local paper beside his name. His standing in the community collapsed, and the detail that said everything was which people withdrew from him first. It was not the neighbors who had disliked him. It was the ones who had gone along, the ones who had nodded in the clubhouse in July, who now needed very badly for everybody to see them standing somewhere else. The nuisance suit was dismissed in October, and the house went on the market at the end of the month. The county closed its file in the first week of November. Ridgeline called 11 days later and reinstated the contract with a January start, and Sierra read the email over her father's shoulder and said that this was the first time all year she had watched him get something back instead of lose it. None of that was what he would have called the victory. The victory was that his daughter finally knew who her father actually was. Not the legend. Not the man who could not be beaten, but a man who had been badly hurt, had made a serious mistake about how to handle it, and was learning how to open the drawer again. Tristan came to the fence on the morning the moving truck was loading. He came alone, no friends, no phone, nothing in his hands, and he stood on his side of the low rail while Terrence set a bag of soil down on the other. The question he asked was the one he had been carrying since a June night in a dark garage with a video running at quarter speed. "You could have broken my wrist that day in the yard," he said. and on the concrete. Both times. Right. Terrence did not deny it. He looked at the young man for a while, and then nodded once. So why didn't you? Because beating you was never the point, Terrence said. I needed you to not be able to reach my daughter. The second that was true, there was nothing left to do. Tristan stood there and did not answer, because what had just been said did not fit anywhere in the framework he had been handed at birth. For the first time, he understood that the two of them had never once been in the same contest. He had been fighting to prove he was strong. The man across the fence had only ever moved when somebody needed protecting, and those are not two levels of the same thing. They are two different things entirely, and only one of them holds up after the audience goes home. He turned and walked back toward the truck without apologizing and without offering his hand, because he had not gotten there yet, and nobody in that yard pretended otherwise. Terrence went around to the back where Sierra was on her knees at the end of the bed replanting the lilacs. She had brought Rachel's letter out with her that morning in a clear plastic sleeve and set it on the flat stone at the edge of the row where it caught the light. 3 of the 8 bushes had been snapped off at the base in June, and several of the canes were dead the whole way down, but the roots underneath were still alum. And that was the only fact that mattered to either of them. He knelt beside his daughter and started working. She told him without looking up that she did not need him to tell her every classified thing he had ever done, and she pressed the soil down firmly around one of the crowns with both healed palms. I just don't want you turning yourself into another secret, she said. He told her he understood, and they kept planting until the light went with no applause and no audience and nobody on that street needing to know how dangerous Terrence Maddox had ever been, because by then he had stopped needing to prove it himself. Most of us will never be tested the way that man was tested on a lawn in September, but nearly all of us will meet somebody who mistakes patience for weakness. And nearly all of us will have to decide at least once what to do with whatever power we happen to be holding on a day when nobody would blame us for using it. Real strength was never about showing a person what you could do to them. It was about knowing the moment you no longer had to and walking away with it still in your hands. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and come back for the next one. This channel is built on stories about the people the world writes off as harmless right up until the second it cannot anymore. Tell us in the comments about the quietest strong person you have ever known, because somebody reading is going to need to hear that such people exist.